I want to bring in now longtime aide to Dick Cheney, Pete Williams, serving as his congressional press secretary and then spokesman at the Pentagon. He is also a former assistant secretary of defense for public affairs. Good morning to you, and thank you so much for sharing your stories this morning on Dick Cheney. I was told earlier this morning about how good of a listener he was. Often came across as quiet behind the scenes because he was taking it all in. Describe your working relationship with him and personal one.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good observation. You know, here's a guy who grew up in the same hometown I did, Casper, Wyoming, dropped out of Yale, worked power lines for a while, then finally turned his life around and became this influential figure, as Chris Cillizza so accurately summed up. And I always wondered when I would go up to his office in the Pentagon and meet with him, where that instinct came from. It was obviously inborn. Look at all the work that he did in the run-up to the first Gulf War. I mean, he was never had experience as Secretary of Defense before he came to the Pentagon, obviously. But he had a series of meetings. He studied the situation in Iraq. And then when the decision was finally made to launch Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, he felt he knew exactly what to do and followed his instincts exactly. And it was fascinating to watch him practice in that way. You know, his wife, Lynn, in introducing him at the Republican convention, had a line about him that I always thought was very accurate. She said there was no conversation that wouldn't be improved by having him in it. And I always felt that way. Every time I met with him, whether it was in the House or in the Pentagon, I always came away from a meeting with him or a session with him thinking that I had learned something.
You know, he also was described as someone who approached every job he had with a certain level of seriousness. I think George W. Bush said that this morning. Do you believe in all of his time in political office, he ever thought about what his legacy would be, or would you describe him as someone who was more in the moment? What would you think of today and what's being said about him? What would he think? Excuse me.
I would say that he was not overly concerned about his legacy. He was well aware of how controversial he was, and that didn't bother him. He had a firm set of beliefs, and he followed them exactly. He did not blow with the political winds, which for him was a strength. And I don't think he would be concerned about his legacy. I think he would say that if he wanted to be judged for anything, it would be protecting the country after the 9/11 attacks, the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Certainly, they've been very controversial, but I think you have to appreciate what a searing moment it must have been for him to be sitting in the White House with the president on the road, these attacks happening. No one really knew what was happening, and he had to face the prospect of ordering a shoot down of a civilian airliner, and then the Secret Service hustles him down to a bunker under the White House. I think that reflected, that was a searing moment for him, and he was determined to do anything he could to protect the country thereafter.
Yeah, I think few of us will ever forget the feeling we had in that same moment as that news came in. Pete, he was plagued with health issues, 5 heart attacks over the years. Were you aware at all of how he was doing in the last year leading up to his passing?
Yeah, plagued with health issues. But the other thing is, you know, he had a long life, much longer than it would have been had it not been for all the advancements. It seemed like every time he came up with some problem with his heart, there was just a medical advancement that allowed them to fix it. So his life had that extension on it, which allowed him to have a rich experience with his children and his grandchildren. And I think that was very, very important to him. The other thing is, you know, all this talk about how resolute he was and a man of integrity, all true. Many people don't realize he was also someone who had a great sense of humor. And that's one of the things I remember him so well about. We were at a NATO meeting once, and he had a person from Wyoming who had actually been the best man at his wedding, who became the U.S. ambassador to NATO, Dave Nicholas from Laramie, Wyoming. And as we were going into a meeting, some protesters fired a paintball at Dave Nicholas. And Nicholas came in to the meeting and said to Cheney, they attacked me because I think they thought I was you. And Cheney said, well, why do you think I hired you? That was the kind of sense of humor he had. But he was also very loyal to the people who worked for him. He was always defending us, rescuing us from our mistakes. And that's one of the things I remember him for.
Hey, some great one-liners and certainly loyal. Pete Williams, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us this morning. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.